when President Clinton went to Moscow to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Allied victory in World War II, only a few commentators saw the irony of the occasion. The president was actually commemorating a triumph of the Red Army, which had invaded Poland at the beginning of the war, and had conquered it at the end. The solemn ceremonies made no mention of Joseph Stalin, the man who had helped begin that war and who became its chief beneficiary. But World War II without Stalin is Hamlet without the prince, or rather Macbeth without the king. The official mythology of the victors holds that the war was a great victory over evil, an evil personified in Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini. The Japanese villains of the time have been either forgiven or forgotten. Even today politicians of both major parties point to it as a rebuke to isolationists then and now. But who won? What was really achieved, and what is the legacy of the war? Blessing for communism. The chief facts are only too obvious, though liberal opinion has tried to ignore them for half a century. The results of the war make the darkest fears of the pre-war isolationists seem like innocent hopes. Yet the compulsory optimism of the victors continues even now to disguise the truth. The current festivities illustrate that most of us are still parroting official wartime propaganda, as if nothing had been learned since 1945. Like World War I, which toppled the Russian Tsars, World War II proved a historic blessing for communism. The Second War, incomparably more destructive than the first, was chiefly a victory for the Soviet Union, which finished the war as a mighty empire and a major world power. With the aid and consent of the US and British governments, which assisted in the repatriation of countless Russians and other Slavs, tens of millions of European Christians fell under the control of a communist regime that had already murdered tens of millions even before the war began. Within 3 years, East Germany, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria were all Soviet satellites. The Allies' partnership with one of the original aggressors made hypocrisy of the Allied claim to be fighting for democracy. One result of the war was the destruction of democracy, and any semblance of freedom, in Eastern Europe. A terrible system of repression, far beyond anything even fascism had attempted, immediately prevailed. Dissent, private property, the independent press, and all free institutions were abolished. Stalin and his puppet regimes launched a persecution of Christianity so ferocious as to make the Roman Empire seem, by comparison, a model of easygoing tolerance. Liberal opinion, never sympathetic to Christian victims of tyranny, and actively hostile to the idea of a Christian society, has chosen to pay almost no attention to the scandalous facts. And so it has obscured from view the deepest consequence of its holy war, the near destruction of what was once called Christian civilization. Even now liberals belittle, as far as possible, the evil of communism, reserving their fiercest opprobrium for anti-communists, McCarthyites, Birchers, and similar miscreants. Until the publication of Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago made the grim truth undeniable. It was a liberal cliché that the Russian people were better off under communism than they had been under the Tsars. But no revelations can earn anti-communists liberal forgiveness. Indulging Uncle Joe. The Allied governments were remarkably indulgent toward the Soviet Union all through the war, and even before the Soviet Union was forced to join them by the German invasion of 1941. When the Soviets invaded Poland shortly after Germany did in the fall of 1939, Britain and France did not declare war on the USSR, nor did they do so when the Soviets also attacked Finland and seized the Baltic states in 1940. The Roosevelt administration's public friendliness to Uncle Joe was more than matched by its secret benefactions. The full story of aid to the Soviets under the Lend-Lease Act remains to be told. But hints of its real dimensions, even beyond the publicly disclosed $12 billion worth of equipment, were laid out in the published diaries of Major George Racy Jordan in 1952. Major Jordan had helped administer the act, and he witnessed many things he found incomprehensible at the time, such as the secret shipment of uranium and related technology to Russia in 1943, long before he heard of the atomic bomb and the Manhattan Project. His detailed account suggests that Roosevelt's inner circle, especially Roosevelt's close advisor Harry Hopkins, was eager to help its Soviet friends develop their own bomb. Even as the war against the Axis raged, then, the Allied governments were busy building up a post-war enemy that would be far more powerful, and far more hostile to the West, than the Axis powers ever were, with the capacity to annihilate millions of Americans at any time. Selective war crimes. Estimates of the number of war dead vary, but the most commonly cited figure is about 55 to 60 million, more than 3 times the number who perished in the Great War. What is more, 2/3 of these dead were civilians. About 1/6 of the dead in World War I were non-combatants. The Christian taboo against killing the helpless still had some force. But in World War II that taboo was shattered. By some estimates, 70% of the war dead were civilians. There is reason to believe the real percentage is even higher. Anniversary reflections by pundits and commentators have rarely failed to note that it was the sacrifice of some 26 to 30 million Soviet lives that purchased the victory against Hitler, thus our continued debt to Stalin's political heirs. However, as Professor R.J. Rummel observes in his comprehensive study, Lethal Politics, Soviet Genocide and Mass Murder since 1917, engaging the Soviet toll during this period, World War II, there are a number of sources of death to consider. First, Rummel notes, are the number of battle killed, which he puts at probably almost 7 million. Altogether, civilian and military deaths due directly or indirectly to war battles, and those otherwise killed by the Nazis, total a probable 19,625,000, a mind-numbing total to be sure. But, says Rummel, this still leaves many millions of corpses to explain. Now, the Soviet people were under attack from 2 directions, the Nazi military machine and the Soviet Communist Party. The imprisonment and killing of enemies of the people by the party not only continued during the war, but was intensified. A large number of the Soviet World War II dead were killed by Stalin, not Hitler, probably 10 million more. But Stalin's culpability extends to the deaths of many of those millions killed by Hitler's forces as well. Through his endless purges, over 35,000 Soviet military officers were slaughtered, and those who remained were left fearful and demoralized, unable to provide effective leadership against the German advance. This auto-destruction of Stalin's own general staff resulted in much higher death and casualty tolls among Soviet troops during World War II than would have occurred otherwise. The Nuremberg and Tokyo war crimes trials, themselves in violation of civilized law, and apart from the grotesque participation of Soviet jurists, focused attention on German and Japanese atrocities, especially the Nazi mass murders of Jews. But the Allies themselves had made a policy of firebombing cities, from Berlin to Tokyo, for the purpose of terrorizing their populations into surrender. In his book Wartime, Paul Fussell observes that the war began with talk of precision bombing and surgical strikes, but quickly yielded, in the logic of modern war, to a quest for bigger and cruder weapons, culminating in the atomic bomb. It is easy to imagine what the Allies would have said had the Axis been the first to develop and use this terrible weapon, and they would have been right. As it is, we are told that the 2 bombs that destroyed 2 cities shortened the war. The need for self-justification has dimmed our most basic moral sense. It is instructive to study US government propaganda of the period. In the famous film series Why We Fight, directed by Frank Capra, Americans were whipped into a frenzy of hatred, even race hatred. The Japanese were likened to monkeys, reviled for their grinning yellow faces, and accused of killing tens of thousands of Chinese with aerial bombing. The filmmakers were apparently not privy to the coming US policy. Germans were described as historically aggressive, our Russian allies as historically brave. Everything was reduced to simple melodrama. Liberals today are slightly embarrassed by such stuff, They weren't embarrassed then. In other respects, though, their view of the war has hardly changed. On the home front, the domestic consequences of the war also defy calculation. The power of the federal government over the country's internal life was so greatly increased and concentrated that it is now a misnomer to call it federal. The incarceration of Japanese Americans, who were stripped of their rights without due process of law, illustrated Franklin Roosevelt's utter contempt for the Constitution, which he had already flouted in both his New Deal legislation and in his furtive pre-Pearl Harbor efforts to help the British without notifying Congress. He had privately confessed that if the facts became known, he would be impeached. In a way, Americans were lucky. They lost nearly 300,000 of their sons in battle, but this was a much smaller fraction of the total population than other nations had lost. Despite absurd propaganda about the Axis desire for world conquest, our shores were never invaded, or even touched by the foot of an enemy soldier. But few were so foolish as to think they might be. The war was always foreign, over there. The sympathetic biographer Ted Morgan describes how Roosevelt strained to create the fear of Nazi penetration of the Western Hemisphere, casting about for some way to make the American people see that the war was dangerous to them. FDR hit on the Nazi threat to Latin America. But unlike communism, Nazi ideology didn't travel well. The idea of Aryan supremacy could hardly captivate descendants of South American Indians. Just as Roosevelt's New Deal stretched the term general welfare to the point of meaninglessness, so the war he sought stretched the common defense of the United States to comprehend a kind of interventionism never envisioned by the Founding Fathers. The abusive term isolationism bespoke his profound repudiation of the Founders' philosophy of national interest and principled aloofness from foreign broils. In his view, the United Nations replaced the United States, even as he enlisted American patriotism and racial animosities, in a cause of which most Americans suspected nothing. Norman Rockwell caught the pathos of the time in a painting called War News. It shows four middle-aged working men in a diner huddled around a small Philco shelf radio, listening intently for the latest dispatches from the front, or fronts. They are the sort of men who, a decade earlier, might have voted for Roosevelt as the champion of the common man, the little guy. Now they are trying to guess where their sons are. Foundation for a New Order. The war effort finally united the country in the way Roosevelt had always wanted to unite it, one nation, under him. Like World War I, it enabled the federal government to centralize power and commandeer the national economy on a fascist socialist model. The ancient rule of law was replaced by bureaucratic dictate. Americans became acclimated to a style of government that had always been alien to them, and profoundly incompatible with the philosophy of their founding fathers. Roosevelt himself was the founding father of a new order, under which we still live. His New Deal subverted the principle of federalism and laid the foundations of today's limitless and lawless government. His war undermined national self-interest and sovereignty, as well as Christian civilization itself. The New World Order really coalesced under him, not George Bush. To this day, the legitimacy of the New Order, domestic and international, rests on the dual myth that Roosevelt saved us from the Depression and led us through World War II. The allegedly benign results of his policies are cited to justify his infractions of constitutional law, his contempt for American tradition, his secret scheming for war, and his general mendacity. Without these myths, liberalism would have little to boast of. In fact, it would be recognized as the destructive force it was from the very beginning. Unhappily, most Americans have been beguiled by the official propaganda line that Roosevelt saved them from mass starvation and global fascist tyranny. They are only now beginning to realize that the federal government is not necessarily their great protector. Yet even many conservatives still suppose that the liberal regime, however intolerable it has lately become, was at least beneficent in Roosevelt's day. Worse yet, The Roosevelt mythology has distorted Americans' understanding of their own tradition of limited constitutional government. The material toll of World War II did not end in 1945. The war created both the nuclear age and a far more menacing enemy than Germany ever was. As trillions of dollars were poured into a newly enlarged military establishment, the Cold War consumed vast American resources that would otherwise have been invested in bettering life for ordinary people. The foreign threat also distracted conservatives from pursuing what should have been their chief mission, restoring the constitutional government Roosevelt had done so much to destroy. Western paganism. For the same reasons, American liberals were, after the communist rulers, the war's foremost beneficiaries. Opposition to the New Deal was largely put aside as conservatives looked to the federal government as the bulwark against the Red Menace. In this way too, the welfare state gained legitimacy by sheer acquiescence. One way and another, the American people became accustomed to a level of state control and taxation far beyond anything King George III had ever imposed on their ancestors. Rarely noticed, but all important, is the general damage to the civilization beyond our borders. Since World War II, the West has virtually ceased to think of itself as Christian. All its governments have been paganized. Historian John Lukács points out that the best description of their form is not democracy, but a term they have avoided because of its association with Hitler, National Socialism. Shallow politicians may well congratulate themselves on the famous victory of World War II. But seen in proper perspective, that war was a terrible tragedy for the American political tradition and for Christian civilization itself. Unless and until the West faces the full truth,